Four Melek, or kings, ruled in the great realm of Kasch. The first in Nubia, the second in Habash, the third in Kordofan, and the fourth in For. The richest among them was the Nap of Naphtha in Kordofan. His capital lay in the direction of Hophratan Nahas. The king possessed all the gold and copper in the country. The gold and copper were transported to Nubia, where the great monarchs of the west sent for it. From the east, ambassadors came across the sea, and in the south the king ruled over many peoples who forged him weapons of iron and sent him slaves. Thousands of these slaves lived at the court of the Nap. The Nap of Naphtha was the richest man on earth, but he led the shortest and saddest life of anyone who ever existed. For each Nap of Naphtha could rule his land only for a certain number of years. Every night during his reign, the priest studied the stars, offered sacrifices, and built fires. They could not miss a single evening of their prayers and sacrifices, otherwise they would lose sight of the celestial trajectories and would not know when, according to the stars' dictates, the king was to be killed. And so it went on for a long time. Day after day, year after year, the priests studied the stars and recognized the day on which the king had to be killed. Once again, the day of the king's death arrived. They broke the hind legs of the bulls. All the fires in the kingdom were extinguished. The priest lit a new fire and summoned the new king. The new king was the son of the sister of the king who had just been killed. The new king was called Kasch. It was during his reign that the ancient institutions of the kingdom were irrevocably changed. And the people say that this change was the cause of the ruin of Naphtha. The first task of the new Nap was to decide who would join him in death when the appropriate time came. The Nap chose these companions from amongst his nearest and dearest. Now, some time before, a king from the distant east had sent a man across the sea to Naphtha, a man famous for his skill in telling stories. This man's name was Pharlemas. And so Pharlemas arrived among the slaves at the court of the Nap. King Kasch had seen him. And Pharlemas had pleased King Kasch. King Kasch said, "He will be the first of my companions. For all the time left me before my end, he will entertain me with his stories, and he will cheer me after my death as well." When Pharlemas heard the king's decision, he was not frightened. "It's God's will," he said to himself. In those days, it was the custom in Naphtha to keep a fire perpetually burning, as people still do in the remote areas of For. The priests always chose a boy and girl to maintain the fire. These two had to guard the fire and lead a chaste life. And likewise, they were killed, not along with the king, but when the new fire started. The moment the priests lit the new fire for King Kasch, they selected the king's youngest sister to be the keeper of the fire. Her name was Sali, S-A-L-I, at least that was what they called her. Her full name was Sali Furhamir. When Sali heard that the choice had fallen upon her, she was afraid. She had a great fear of death. For a time, the king lived in happiness and contentment, for he enjoyed the riches and splendors of his land, and he spent his evenings with friends and foreigners who had come as ambassadors to the land of Naphtha. But one evening, God sent him the thought that each of those delightful days brought him one day closer to certain death. The king was frightened. He tried to dispel the thought, but he did not succeed. King Elah became very sad. Then God sent him a second thought, that he should send for Pharlemas and have him tell a story. Farlamas was summoned, and he came to the court. The king said, "Farlamas, today is the day. You must make me happy. Tell me a story." No sooner said than done, Farlamas replied, and began telling a story. The king listened. The guests listened. The king and the guests forgot to drink. They forgot to breathe. The slaves forgot to serve. Farlamas' story was like hashish. And when he finished, all were immersed in pleasant oblivion. King Kasch had forgotten his thoughts of death. None of those present had noticed that Farlamas had been talking straight through the night. By the time the guests took their leave, the sun was already high. The next day, King Kasch and his guests were impatient for evening to come so that Farlamas could begin his story. Now Farlamas had to tell his story every night. The news of the fables of Farlamas spread throughout the court, the capital, and the country, and each time Farlamas told a better story. And every day the king gave him a beautiful garment, and the guests and ambassadors gave him gold and precious stones, and when he walked through the city, a swarm of slaves followed him. The people loved him. The people began to bare their breasts before him. The news of the wondrous tales of Farlamas reached far and wide. Sally, too, found out about them. She sent a message to her brother, the king. "Let me listen once to the tales of Farlamas." The king replied, "Your wish is my command," and Sally came. She wanted to listen to the story. Farlamas saw Sally, and he lost his head for a moment. Farlamas saw only Sally, and Sally saw only Farlamas. King Kasch said, "Why aren't you telling a story? Don't you know any more?" Farlamas tore his gaze from Sally and began his tale. At first the story of Farlamas was like hashish when it induces a slight daze. And then it was like hashish that brings on sleep and leads to unconsciousness. After a short while, King Kasch and his guests dozed off, but they went on listening to the story in their dreams, and they were soon in a state of utter ecstasy. Only Sally kept her eyes open. Her eyes were glued on Farlamas. Her eyes drank in all of Farlamas. Sally was brimming with Farlamas. When Farlamas had finished, he stood up. Sally stood up. Farlamas went toward Sally. Sally went toward Farlamas. Farlamas embraced Sally. Sally embraced Farlamas and said, "We do not want to die." Farlamas laughed into Sally's eyes. He said, "The will is in you. Show me the way." Sally said, "Leave me now. I will seek the way. When I have found it, I will send word to you." Sally and Farlamas separated. The king and his guests slept on. The next day, Sally went to the high priest and said, "Who decides the day when the old fire must be extinguished and the new one lit?" The priest said, "God decides." Sally said, "How does God communicate his decision?" The priest said, "Every night we study the stars. We never lose sight of them. Every night we look up at the moon. Every day we know which stars are approaching her and which stars are moving away. This is how we know the hour." Sally said, "Must you do it every night? What happens if one night you do not look?" And the priest said, "If one night we do not look, we must offer a sacrifice. If for many nights we did not look, we would no longer know our way." Sally said, "And you would not know at what moment you should put out the fire." The priest said, "No, we would no longer be able to do our duty." Sally said, "Great are the works of God, but greatest is not his writing in the sky. The greatest is life on earth. I realized that last night." The priest said, "What do you mean?" Sally said, "God has given Farlamas the gift of storytelling as no one has ever possessed it before. This is greater than writing in the sky." The high priest said, "You are wrong." Sally said, "You know the moon and stars. Have you ever heard the stories of Farlamas?" The priest said, "No, I have never heard them." Sally said, then how can you judge? Believe me, all of you, when you listen, you will forget to look at the stars. The high priest said, you allege this, sister of the king? Sally said, prove it to me that I am wrong then, that this writing in the sky is stronger and greater than life on earth. The priest said, I will prove it. The high priest sent a message to King Kasch, allow the priest to come to your palace this evening to listen to the stories of Farlamas from sunset to moonrise. King Kasch replied, I consent. Sally sent a message to Farlamas, today you must tell your story as you did yesterday. This is the way. When evening came, King Kasch gathered his guests and the ambassadors. Sally arrived and took her place beside him. All the priests came. They bared their breasts and flung themselves on the ground. The high priest said, the stories of this Farlamas must be the most splendid of God's works. King Kasch said, decide that for yourselves. The high priest said, forgive us, O king, if we leave your house at moonrise to perform our duties. King Kasch said, do as God wills. The priest sat down. All the guests and ambassadors sat down. The hall was full. Farlamas came forward. King Kasch said, begin, my companion in death. Farlamas looked at Sally, and Sally looked at Farlamas. King Kasch said, why don't you tell a story? Are there no more to tell? Farlamas turned his gaze away from Sally. Farlamas began to tell his tale at sunset. His story was like the hashish that clouds and captivates. His story became like the hashish that produces oblivion. By the time the moon rose, Kasch and his guests and the ambassadors had dozed off, and all the priests lay in a deep sleep. Only Sally remained awake and absorbed with her gaze the ever sweeter words falling from the lips of Farlamas. Farlamas brought his tale to an end. He stood up. Farlamas went toward Sally. Sally went toward Farlamas. Sally said, let me kiss those lips from which such sweet words come. They sucked hard on each other's lips. Farlamas said, let me embrace this form, the mere sight of which gives me strength. And they embraced, entwining their arms and legs, and they lay amidst all the sleepers and were happy to the point of heartbreak. But Sally rejoiced and said, do you see the way? Farlamas said, I see it. They departed. In the palace, only the sleepers remained. The next day, Sally went to the high priest and said, now tell me, were you right to scoff at my words? The priest said, I will not give you an answer today. We will go once more to listen to Farlamas, for yesterday we were not suitably prepared. Sally said, very well. And the priests performed their sacrifices and recited their prayers. They broke the fetlocks of many oxen. Throughout the day, the prayers in the temple were never interrupted. And that evening, all the priests returned to the palace of King Kasch. That evening, Sally again sat by the side of her brother, King Kasch. That evening, Farlamas resumed his story. And before the dawn broke, everyone had fallen asleep in the ecstasy of listening. But amid the sleepers lay Sally and Farlamas, and they sucked the happiness from each other's lips and entwined their arms and legs. And so it went night after night. Among the people, the news of Farlamas' story spread first. Then the rumor circulated that at night the priests neglected their sacrifices and prayers, and a great uneasiness seized everyone. One day an important man from the city met the high priest, and the important man said to the priest, when will we celebrate the next feast of this year? I would like to make a journey and return in time for the feast. How long is it? Until the day of the feast. The priest was embarrassed. It had been several days since he had looked at the moon and stars. He had learned nothing more about their course. The priest said, wait one more day and I'll be able to tell you. The important man said, thank you. Tomorrow I'll come see you again. The high priest gathered his priests around him and asked, "Which of you has lately observed the course of the stars?" None of the priests answered, because they had all stayed to listen to the stories of Pharlamas. The high priest asked again, "Hasn't even one of you observed the course of the stars and the position of the moon?" And all the priests were silent until one of them, a very old man, stood up and said, "We were all in ecstasy, reclining before Pharlamas. Nobody can tell you on which day the feast must be celebrated, or when the fire must be extinguished, and when a new one must be lit." The high priest shuddered and said, "How could all this happen? What shall I tell the people?" The old priest said, "It is the will of God. But if this Pharlamas has not been sent by God, put him to death. For if he lives and continues to speak, everyone will listen to him." And the high priest said, "What must I say to the people?" Everyone remained silent, and they parted. The high priest went to Salih, and he asked, "What were the words you said that first day?" Salih replied, "I said, 'Great are the works of God, but the greatest is not his writing in the sky, it is life on earth.' And you reproached me for my words, and you said they were wrong. Tell me now today whether I lied." The priest said, "Pharlamas is against God. Pharlamas must die." Salih said, "Pharlamas is the companion in death of King Akaf." The priest said, "I shall speak with King Akaf." Salih said, "God is in my brother King Akaf. Ask him what his thoughts are." The high priest went to King Akaf, whose sister Salih was beside him. The priest uncovered himself before King Akaf and bowed down and said, "Forgive me, King Akaf." The king said, "Tell me what troubles your heart." The priest said, "Speak to me of your companion in death, this Pharlamas." The king said, "In the beginning, God sent me thoughts of death. I knew that it was growing near, and I was terrified. Then God made me remember this Pharlamas, who had been sent to me as a gift from the Orient, beyond the sea. With the first thought, God darkened my intellect. With the second, he comforted my soul and made me and others happy. For this I have given Pharlamas many garments, and my friends have given him gold and precious stones. He has made generous donations to the people. Now he is rich, as befits him, and the people love both him and me." The high priest said, "Pharlamas must die. Pharlamas destroys order." King Akaf said, "I will die before Pharlamas." The high priest said, "God will decide the matter." King Akaf said, "So be it. All the people shall see." The high priest left. Salih said, "King Akaf, my brother, the way is nearing its end. The companion of your death will be he who reawakens you to life. But I demand that he be the happiness of my existence." King Akaf replied, "Then take him, Salih, my sister." Messengers ran throughout the city announcing that Pharlamas would speak that evening to the populace in the great square. In the great square between the king's palace and the houses of the priests, a veiled seat had been erected for the king. And when evening fell, the people collected from all sides and formed a circle. Thousands and thousands of people gathered. The priests came and took their places. The guests and the ambassadors came and took their places. Salih sat beside veiled King Akaf. Pharlamas was called. Pharlamas came. All the servants of Pharlamas followed him. They were dressed in splendid garments. The servants of Pharlamas sat beside the priests. Pharlamas bowed down before King Akaf. Then he took his place. The high priest stood up and said, "Pharlamas has destroyed order in Nabta. Tonight he will demonstrate whether or not his was the will of God." The priest sat down. Pharlamas stood up. He looked into Salih's eyes. Pharlamas tore his gaze from Salih and turned it on the crowd. Pharlamas looked at the priest. He said, "I am a servant of God, and I believe that the evil in men's hearts is abhorrent to him. On this night God will decide." And Pharlamas began his story. The words that came from the mouth of Pharlamas were sweet as honey, as the first summer rain soaks into the parched earth, so his voice penetrated his listeners. The mouth of Pharlamas gave off a scent more subtle than musk and incense, and the head of Pharlamas shone like a torch in the black of the night. At first the story of Pharlamas was like hashish when it makes wakefulness happy. And then the story was like hashish when it makes dreams delirious. Toward morning, Pharlamas raised his voice. As the Nile rises in the hearts of men, so his words swelled. To some, his words brought serenity. To others, they were terrifying as the appearance of Azrael, the angel of death. Happiness filled the spirits of some, and horror the hearts of others. The closing morning came. The mightier that voice grew, and the more it resounded with the people. And the hearts of men rose up against one another, as in battle they raged against one another like clouds in the sky on a stormy night. Flashes of wrath met thunderbolts of fury, and when the sun rose, the tale of Pharlamas reached its end. Ineffable wonder filled the confused minds of the people. For when the living looked around, their gaze fell upon the priests, and the priests were stretched out on the ground dead. Seli stood up. Seli bowed down before the king. Seli said, King Akaf, my brother, cast aside the veil and show yourself to your people and perform the sacrifice yourself. For these men have been cut down by Azrael, by God's command. The servants removed the veils from the throne, and King Akaf stood up. He was the first king the people of Naphtha had ever seen. King Akaf was as handsome as the rising sun. The populace rejoiced. A white horse was led forward, and the king sprang on its back. To his left was his sister, Salih-Fur Hamir, and to his right, Pharlamas. The king rode to the temple. Inside the temple, the king took a spade and dug 3 holes in the sacred earth. He threw 3 seeds into them. And the king dug 2 holes in the sacred earth, and Salih threw 2 seeds into them. And immediately the 5 seeds sprouted and grew before the eyes of the people. At noon, the ears of the 5 plants were ripe. In all the courtyards of the city, fathers broke the fetlocks of great bulls. The king extinguished the fire. All the fathers of the city extinguished the fires in the hearths, and Salih lit a new fire, and all the virgins came to take some of it. From that day on, no one else was ever killed in Naphtha. King Akaf was the first king in Naphtha to live until it pleased God to take him at an advanced age to his bosom. When King Akaf died, Pharlamas was his successor, and under him Naphtha reached the peak of happiness and its end. For the fame of King Akaf as a wise and well-advised king spread quickly through all countries, and princes sent him gifts and sent their clever men to learn from him. All the merchants settled in the city of Naphtha, and King Akaf on the eastern sea had a great many ships which carried the products of Naphtha to the rest of the world. The mines of Naphtha could not supply enough gold and copper to keep the shops full. When Pharlamas succeeded King Akaf, the country's happiness reached its peak. His fame reached beyond all countries from the eastern sea to the western. But as his fame grew, envy took root in men's hearts. And when Pharlamas died, the neighboring countries violated their treaties and made war on Naphtha, and Naphtha was defeated. Naphtha was destroyed, and with it the most magnificent palace of the kingdom. The great realm fell to pieces. It was overrun by savage peoples. Men forgot the mines of gold and silver, and the cities disappeared. Of Naphtha's glory years nothing remained but the tales of Pharlamas, which he had brought with him from the land beyond the eastern sea. This is the story of the ruin of the land of Kasch. Its last remaining sons live in the land of 4, which we know as Darfur in the Sudan.